Hello, welcome again to another video on the exchange variation in the Alekhine. So in the previous chapter, we've taken a look at different options in this position, mainly the move g4 and h3. It seems to be the most dangerous. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at the more common moves in this position, which are bishop b2 and the move knight f3. By far the most played moves, and very often they transpose. That could be a bit confusing at some times, but I try to help you as much as I can with that. So where do we start? Well, let's start with the move knight f3. So yeah, very often, like I said, it transposes with bishop b2. So the main thing that probably I should address here is what happens if they transpose. So after both moves, we're going to play d5. White's going to play c5. Let me mention quickly what happens if white does not play c5 at some point. Well, after c takes, we take back, knight takes, queen d6. And basically, we have no problems. We have smooth development. White has no initiative. And we even have a target on d4 for our pieces. So this is not... this is by almost always we automatically assume that white plays c5 because c5 is simply the most dangerous option. What happens is white plays bishop b2. Well, in one of the lines in one of the next chapters, you'll see that keeping attention is actually quite an interesting idea for white. And after knight c6, short castle, bishop g4, c5, we actually transpose to a line that I will address. Right now. This is what I wanted to get out of the way first, because this is what I mean with the transposition. Yeah, so in this case, white started with knight f3. So let's now go back to what happens after bishop b2. On bishop b2, d5, c5, knight c8. Here the main move is actually bishop f3, which we'll address shortly. But to get this transposition out of the way, after knight f3, which is the second most played move in this position, knight c6, short castle, bishop g4, we once again have transposed to the same position. And it seems like white has been very clever with his move order, because in chapter 1.6 we have this exact position, only with the rook on a1. So the rook on c1 seems like white has got an advantage here compared to the rook on a1, but that's actually not really the case. In most cases, one of the best moves for white is to actually play rook b1 to support the b4 push. And it doesn't matter where the rook initially started, be it on a1 or on c1 for that. So this position is actually, it should transpose to chapter 1.6. And therefore, I'm not really going to pay too much attention to this position right now. In the files, I have included one or two extra lines to which white might make use of the rook on c1, but it's not really necessary to go too deeply in this, because it's still more or less the same as chapter 1.6. So I just recommend you to take a look at the files if you're curious, and otherwise chapter 1.6 will clarify a few things in this position for sure. All right? So now that the transposition is out of the way, we can move on to the more slight differences here. And once again, let's start with the alternatives after the move knight f3. So, as we know, d5 is the move here. Bishop g4 immediately might work as well. I've made it a clickable in the files if you want to have a look at it. So you can click on this move and then you will find some explanations with it. I've given them in the files, so if you're curious. But let's focus on d5. c5, knight c8. So once again, if bishop e2, we transpose to the line that I just gave. So what are the alternatives? Well, one idea for white is to try and prevent us from playing bishop g4, playing the move h3. And it seems like white therefore has solved one of the biggest issues here. But that's not the case. After knight c6, bishop e2, there is a move here that black can play, and I want you to take a second to guess what that move is. All right. Well, I hope you get to the right move, because we can still trade off our light squared bishops for the white knight on f3 with the move bishop e4. This is a move really to remember, because if white does not take on e4 but plays short castle, then we have a very decent position again after taking on f3. Taking on f3, e6, and as the arrows indicate, we have the play that you will become very familiar with at the end of watching the videos on the exchange variation. To summarize, our idea is we want to put our knight on f5, targeting d4 and e3. And in some situations, b6 is a good move to target the center as well. So, when I was playing these type of positions online, I very often actually won the d4 pawn by playing knight e7, knight f5, queen f6, and then take on d4 with either knight, because white simply wasn't able or forgot to defend the d4 pawn. Yeah, I've had many wins like that, which is very satisfying. But of course, we need to address what happens if white does not make that mistake. You might wonder, after bishop b4, but Roland, isn't there knight takes e4? Well, that's a good question. Yes, because after taking, we did structure is different, of course, but the problem is the d4 pawn. The knight needs to move since it's attacked by our pawn, and then the d4 pawn is 3 times attacked, so we win the d4 pawn at this point. Knight g5, knight takes d4, short castle. I've put short castle in there because it was played, but I'm wondering why white cannot take on e4. And I think the reason is because of queen a5 check, if I'm not mistaken. There's also the move of the knight takes e4, queen d5, which might be interesting, but that's something that I have to check. I'm not exactly sure why white cannot take on e4. But we do transpose, because after short castle, the best move for black is actually to play a6. And now white can take comfortably on e4. And the idea of knight a6 is actually to create a good square for knight on c8 through a7. The knight will come to c6 or to b5, and then we have a very solid position. And even though we don't have the bishop pair at this point, our knights are more than compensating for that small disadvantage. But this was actually a game between two Hungarian grandmasters, Oliver Mihok, who is actually a teammate of mine in Belgium, and Ferenc Berkes, if I pronounced that correctly. Don't beat me up if I pronounce it wrongly. Okay, be kind to me. All right, so yeah. Anyway, bishop e4, definitely a move to remember here, after white tries to prevent us from playing bishop g4. There is another move which might be very clever for white, and that's that we still haven't played knight c6 here, which means that white is in time to play b4. So white is postponing castling again by kind of greedily advancing on the queen side. White wants to get as much play on the queen side as possible. I thought this was a really interesting idea. It hasn't been played that much, but I think this was also one of the number one engine moves here. We play a6, our usual reaction to b4, and well, if white plays bishop b2, we play knight c6, and then we more or less transpose to the most common position there. But what happens if white goes ultra greed and plays a4 here? Well, in this case, knight c6 isn't the best. In certain positions, knight c6 is okay, because after b5 takes, knight a5, we have our knight on a5 is quite decently placed, since it can jump here to c4, and it sometimes can jump to b3. In this particular case, I'm not a big fan of that, because after bishop b2, we still have a weak knight on c8. We might be okay still, but I wasn't too comfortable recommending this just yet. And instead of knight c6 here, I decided to recommend bishop g4. Just so that the bishop taking on f3, it will happen rather sooner than later. Bishop b2, normal developing move. If white plays h3, I didn't include this, but I'm sure this is clear. You want to take, queen takes, play e6, and then knight c6, and this on the next moves. So that should be very clear. Bishop b2, white simply develops. And now I have a slight improvement over another game that was played in this position, which is the move e6. In that game, knight c6 was played, and after b5 taking, knight f5, should castle, e6 was the move. And here I think white had a very good move, which is knight a4, which was actually also played between two grandmasters in Dubai 2017. And once again, the knight on c8 was a problem. The knight's covering b6, which is kind of critical at this moment, and so we are very, very passive. White was definitely on top there. So, if we go back, my reason for e6 is that I want to get the c8 knight out as soon as possible. And b5 prevents us from playing knight c6, but I have another idea. So after b5, a takes, playing knight e7. Yeah, by the way, notice how our rook is not blocked by a knight at this point, so our rook has free range over the a-file. Knight e7, should castle, takes, knight f5. And my idea is to put the knight not on a5, but simply to d7 as indicated. And even though this looks very nice, we are probably going to get opposite colored bishops, because we will take on e3 at some point. And we have a nice a-file for a rook, so I do think that this is a very acceptable position for us. We have solved most of our problems. We do have a little bit of disadvantage on the queen side, but I think that we are going to be fine here. We have lots of active possibilities, as indicated in the arrows. So that's the quick b4 idea. That was kind of interesting here. And let me take a sip of coffee, by the way. All right, thank you. So, b4 is more or less the only extra idea here for white. Most likely white will transpose with bishop b2 to the line that we have already discussed. So, all right, that's knight f3. So what about bishop e2? So bishop e2, we are obviously going to play d5, c5, knight c8. And here, the reason why I took this as a main line in my files is because white has a few more extra options here in compared to 10 knight f3. And so once again, it's the final time I'll say it most likely. Otherwise, I'll repeat it. I mean, it's important. So knight f3, knight c6, short castle, bishop g4. A position we will discuss more deeply in chapter 1.6. All right. So the extra options here for white I found are threefold. White can play, once again, a quick b4, which was kind of interesting. Because if white can get queenside domination quickly, then it's always advantageous, because in many lines, white cannot play b4 because we have a knight on c6. So what do we do after b4? You guessed it, almost always a6. And now a4 is the only extra move that I could come up with. Otherwise, we should most likely transpose to knight f3. And that we will discuss once again in later chapters. So a4. In this case, it's too greedy. This should not be good for white. And the reason for that is that knight c6 in this case is good. And after b5, a takes, you might wonder, why is this now good, Roland? Because you just explained that with the knight on c8, it's probably a bit too passive to play like this. Well, I'll tell you, because we have a very nice option in this position. And that's knight takes d4. Yeah, that's the difference between the bishop on e2 and the knight on f3. If the knight was on f3, this wasn't possible. But with the bishop on e2, it is. And the point is very simple. The bishop takes e5, we have successfully good counterplay in the center. If white plays bishop e3, play d4, we win back the piece, and we will have, more than decent position here. Yeah. So that is 12 b4. b4. So after a6, most likely we will transpose to other lines. And there is one extra move which I wanted to address, and which is kind of similar, which we saw in the previous chapter, which is g4. g4 hasn't been played very often, but in this case, it's kind of always an interesting idea for white. We move our bishop back to d7, and compared to the previous chapter, there is a small difference here, and that's that the bishop is on e2 instead, which could be an asset or a liability. So I've included many lines here. Let me wrap my head around that. So let's first of all mention white cannot take on d5. After bishop c6, white simply loses a piece. So taking on d5 is once again not possible. h3 is a bit awkward, comparable to the line of the previous chapter. The bishop was going to g2 instead of to e2. But this is actually kind of decent as well, because the idea is that one wants to put a knight on f3 and to finish development that way. But I wouldn't be too scared of this. After e6, we can play b6 at some point if we want, as indicated in the arrows. But after knight f3, knight c6, queen d2, knight a7, short castle. Both players have now finished development. But with the awkward g4 move, we now can already create some problems for playing f5. That's why whenever my students have a tendency to throw the pawns in front of the king forward, I try to tell them not to because of moves like f5 like this. So we're talking about an exception. I mean, this is still quite decent for white, but I would not be too afraid here, because with this f5 move we already get quite good counterplay here. Yeah. A move to remember. Okay, so let's go back. G4. White could play. Which one should I do first? Okay, I'm sure that this is the most burning question here. What happens if white plays h4 here as well, just as in the previous chapter? Well, we're going to play knight c6, e5 immediately. This idea you saw in the previous chapter as well. This could be interesting too. So I've made that an extra line which you can review in the files. Instead, I want to focus on knight c6. f4. If white plays h5, then, well, you know what's coming. e5, and white is in deep trouble. So white cannot allow that and should play f4. But by pushing the pawns forward, even if you get an attack going, there's always chances for black to get some counterplay. Since the king in the center, the white king is still in the center and white hasn't finished development yet. And also the king will never be completely safe. So from a practical standpoint, this is probably not the most critical line. But objectively, from a computer standpoint, this is a critical line. Or at least one of the recommendations. So f4, we can start attacking by playing b6. And, well, of course I should mention that the point of f4 is to make sure that we cannot play e5. But b6 is definitely good as well. And here, there was a game where white took on b6. And after a takes b6, as indicated with the arrows, I think black has more than enough compensation for the slight space deficit. So one idea to mention is that the knight on c8 looks terrible at this point, but can jump to d6, where it is excellently placed, and we can get some counterplay by playing b5 and b4 at some point to create some threats on the queen side. And yeah, white still needs to prove that the attack is going to break through. If not, then we have a perfectly harmonious position. So, where was I? After b6, knight a4 is, let's say, my improvement over that game for white. Because the idea is that if the white can get a strong knight on c5, even as an improvement over the previous game. So it's still our best move. We should allow it, but b takes c5, knight takes c5, knight c6. So white did achieve to get a knight on c5, but still I think that we have more than enough counterplay in this position. All our pieces look harmonious. We can at some point maybe consider moving the knight to e4. Minority attack comes to mind. And once again, white's attack is still not clearly visible at this point. Yeah, so f4, it's certainly an interesting move, but from a practical standpoint, I would not be too worried here with f4. I would not be too worried here. And what happens if white goes nuts and goes forward? Well, e5, like I said. Okay, I already mentioned that. Good job. Okay, so g4, bishop d7, h4 we've discussed. What move do I still need to mention? Well, there is this strange bishop f3 move, and the idea is similar to the previous chapter where white wanted to play bishop g2 and knight g2. Only now white has put the bishop on f3 to protect the g4 pawn in comparison to h3. And therefore, I think this line is a bit weird. White could have chosen to play h3 instead. But still, it makes sense, so let me mention it a little bit. e6, knight g2, b6. Once again, a good move to break at this point. And white has a few options to try and deal with this, but for example, b4, b takes, knight c6, and we have very good counterplay. Yeah. Whereas in the previous chapter, white could simply, let me go back. I don't have a point to make, actually. Excuse me, I got confused. 1,000 times apologies. Okay, so yeah, let's just say bishop f3, not the most normal move here, since white could have just played h3, bishop g2 instead, which is better than bishop e2 and bishop f3. All right, I think that's it actually about this 12 g4 move. Okay, and we have covered b4. Yeah, let me get my bearings for just a sec. Knight f3, knight c6. Yeah, no. Right, then I think we're ready for the main line, which is bishop f3. So bishop f3 is the most played move here, and that is because of a tactic. Usually with bishop f3, the most normal reaction would be we need to protect the d5 pawn, right? With e6. Well, that's actually a mistake because after g4, our bishop is trapped on f5. So, well, we don't lose the piece after bishop b4, but after takes, it's clear that white was on top. Play is still complicated, but I do want to avoid this pawn sacrifice if I can. And we have a really strong alternative here, actually. And that's, I'm smiling already, e5. Yeah, we don't care about the d5 pawn. Well, we care, but we care more about opening files towards the white king at this point. And I actually played this move in one of my blitz games, and I got a winning position, but screwed it up in time trouble. So, but it was definitely nice to get a line that I've studied on the board. So an e5 is actually, excuse me, really dangerous to deal with for white. First of all, if you were white, what move would you play here? Take a second to think about this. All right. So if you've taken a thought about this position, then you could determine more or less 4 moves that are interesting to play. D takes e5 come to mind. Knight takes d5 comes to mind. Bishop takes d5 comes to mind. And that if you don't play any taking move, capture move, then, for example, after h3, then we're simply going to play e4 with black and have a wonderful position, followed by knight c6, knight e7, b6 perhaps even, and we are simply in control, I would say. So, after e5, the best move is actually bishop takes d5 here. But that's already a bit hard to determine because why? Well, knight takes d5 is kind of easy to answer because e4, the connection between the white dark light squared bishop of white and the knight and d5 is severed, so we win the piece. But what happens after d takes e5? Why is this worse? Well, we're going to play knight c6. d5, we still don't care about that pawn. And we want to take back with the knight on e5. That's why knight c6 is the better move here for it. And frankly, white simply is struggling in this position because if the knight comes to e5, you already see that there are some threats in the position. And if I'm not mistaken, that this was actually what happened in my game. I played knight c6, I think. And so let's go a bit deeper into this position. If white still wants to take the pawn, then after knight takes e5, black was actually already winning here in a game in Monaco 2019, because we have all sorts of ideas here. First of all, knight d3. Second of all, queen a5, which could create some problems for white. And perhaps at some point, a move like rook e8 is a very dangerous in combination with knight takes f3 and bishop e4 to win. Basically, the white position is hanging by a thread at this point. So, what happens after queen takes d5? Yeah, queen takes d5 was played in the blitz game, I remember now, that I played. And here I decided to trade queens, which was actually a mistake. Since the white king is still in the center, usually when you are the attacking player, you want to have as many attacking pieces as possible on the board. So queen takes d5, I thought tactically it was still working, and it was. I wasn't worse. But queen c7 is definitely the way to go here. As indicated with the arrows, we have so many threats that white will have an immensely hard time to deal with it, if it's even possible, and I don't think so. So, to slightly summarize, taking on d5 is very dangerous for white after d takes e5. So after knight c6, actually one of the best moves, believe it or not, is g4 again. And the reason for that is that many of our threats are connected with the bishop being on f5. So I want to chase that bishop away. And here I have a slight improvement over another game, which is bishop d7. In a game, bishop e6 was played, but my issue with that is that after bishop takes d5, white gets to exchange a pair of pieces. In this case, that makes life a lot more easy for white. So after knight takes, bishop takes, we do have knight d3 as an in-between move. But after king f1, f takes, I do think that white's position is more or less manageable. The position is still complicated, but it could be. I like bishop d7 better. Let's just put it that way. So, bishop d7. We once again don't care about the pawn on d5. And white has a few ways to take. If knight takes d5, then knight takes e5 is once again very dangerous for white. Because in this case, white still cannot develop. That's one of the problems still. Because if the knight goes, the bishop hangs. And if the knight goes here, that's first of all extremely awkward. And secondly, the knight on c5 is in trouble. And we even have bishop b5 ideas to stop the king from castling. So the engines are already indicating that we are, even here, having a winning position. So knight takes d5, almost never a good idea for white. So if h3, protecting the g4 pawn, knight takes e5, bishop g2, a little bit of a roundabout way to get that set up for white, but in this case is one of the best options. And after knight e7, knight f3, takes, bishop e6. I have knight e2 as my main line because d4 was a threat. And then after f5, we once again have a very complicated position where we have the initiative at this point. White is not losing here, but it is still quite a difficult position for white to deal with. So, yeah. For all of this combined, I think that d takes e5 is the lesser option here. Bishop takes d5 is, in my opinion, the better move. And it leads to very complicated positions, but where white at least is posing some counter problems. And those counter problems something that we need to deal with as well. So in the other position with d takes e5, white was the one struggling, but we were just creating threats. In this case, we need to be more careful because we are also in danger here. But, of course, I'm going to walk you through it. How do we play this position? We're going to take on d4. And here, if you check the quick starter, I have included two lines. One is bishop takes b7, and the other one is bishop takes d4. Both moves are quite decent for white and are, in my opinion, equally viable. Let's start with bishop takes d4. It seems like the most logical move to make. We take, and knight c6. Notice, by the way, that white cannot be tried to be clever because after bishop takes b7, we have take, and queen e7. And we, as indicated with the arrows, we win the piece because it's a double attack. Yeah, it might not have been necessary to include this, by the way, but bishop takes b7 now is just not good. Queen takes d4, knight c6. So, we're pawn down, but white has still a king in the center. And right now, with the knight on c6, we're actually developing very nice and quickly. So, the queen can go to a few squares at the moment. And in my files, I've included 2 squares for the queen. Let's start with queen d2. And here I want to play knight b4. With the idea to play knight d3. White needs to play bishop c4 to protect it. And also because it's not the only idea that we have here. Otherwise, knight takes d5. So bishop c4. If white plays king f1, then our mission is succeeded. And we actually have a pin now, suddenly, with the bishop on d5. It's pinned because of the queen on d2, which is unprotected. So knight e7, rook d1, takes, bishop d3, and we actually already win a piece here. Oh, no, we don't. Actually, we don't. No, I need to be careful. Knight e2, queen takes b4. Our knight was hanging. That was the thing that I forgot. But after takes, rook e8. This is actually... Sorry. I forgot. This was a win between... I think she is actually a streamer now on Twitch. Dina Belankaya, if I'm not mistaken. She actually was white in this game, and she lost to Mohota in an internet chess game in 2021. Fairly recent. So, of course, the reason is that if the king goes back, we take the rook, and it's checkmate. So, So once again, an indication of how things really can go wrong. So, if white cannot castle, then our mission is complete, because then we have enough compensation for the pawn at the very least. And so instead, bishop c4 is the better move here. We exchange queens, king takes, knight e7. White's managed to trade off queens, but we still have a lot of compensation in this position. And one of the ideas is, as indicated with the arrows, to make use of the d3 square with rook d8 and bishop d3 to create some extra threats. Notice, by the way, how the c5 pawn is also still a target for us, which is quite hard to defend for white. So that's queen d2. Queen f4 is the other good move for white. The idea is to keep an eye out for the b4 square, as we've seen in queen e2. This can create some problems for white. So white's trying to prevent that by putting the queen on f4. And I think it's actually the best square for the queen, actually. We also saw that a pin could be quite dangerous, so that's also helpful. But of course, white is not out of the woods, because we have a really strong move, which is knight e5. Knight e5, the point is that, after queen takes c5, we win the queen, so the knight's indirectly protected, and we can still jump to d3. So even though black managed to avoid our knight b4 move, knight e5 still creates problems for white. White still needs to play bishop c4. We can take it now. B takes. Queen takes c4 might be possible, but after bishop d3, queen f4, knight e7, white's still having a hard time making sure. White still has a hard time to castle. Words, yeah. Words are hard sometimes. Okay. Knight e2, knight e5. We're trying to make sure white still cannot castle. And yeah, so one of the points is that after knight takes, queen takes, white still cannot castle because the knight on e2 is under attack. White's still okay, I suppose, but I wouldn't be comfortable here at all. And no matter what, even if white gets the castle, we should still be able to get more than enough compensation. I clicked. Okay, so what happens after b takes? Well, we're still going to play bishop d3 this time, and trying to undermine white from castling once again. And there is one slight idea that white may use in the future, which is knight d5. But otherwise, these c-pawns are very, very weak at this point. White needs to play like knight g2. Takes. In this case, because, well, there is a little bit of a threat with rook d1. We don't want to get our bishop pinned. Hence we take rook e8. White still cannot castle. Queen d2. Now white can castle. But we play queen e7. White still cannot castle. Rook c2. White can castle. But we win back the pawn. Material is equal. And after the move knight d6, I would definitely prefer black here, actually. Yeah, this was a game between Christian, I don't know if his name's Christian, C. Brewer against Mathieu Cornet. A friend of mine or a teammate of mine from the Belgium competition. Yeah. And yeah, I know that he has studied the Alekhine as well, actually. So if you see a game of Mathieu Cornet in the database of the Alekhine opening, then it's always interesting to check that out. So in this case, a success story. Black got a wonderful position here, and is actually dominating here. So. Right, let's go all the way back. This was kind of a long journey at this point. This was bishop takes d4. Now let's take a look at the complicated move bishop takes b7. White ignores the pawn on d4 and goes for the rook on a8 instead. Take on e3. The bishop is the more important piece in this case, since it also opens up the e-file for us. D takes. White should trade off queens. As I said, when you're the attacking player, trading off queens is actually something you should avoid. So white needs to take the opportunity to take. For example, if white doesn't but played knight g2, then taking, queen e7, double attacking the bishop and the pawn, make sure that we already have really nice counterplay at this point. The knights are coming into the game. White cannot castle, and white will have a hard time, defending all the dark squares in this position. I would say black is already better here. So let's go back. White needs to trade queens, but queen takes d8. And here we could make an in-between move on f2, but it's actually not helpful. We actually should take back. And after bishop takes, the best move here for white is knight a6. The reason why taking here is not good, because it helps white develop. King takes, let's say, knight d7 to get the knight out. But the problem is that after knight g2, white is quicker getting the rook on h1 in. And that is why taking on f2 is not recommended in this position. There is a move we can play with bishop d4, but even that kind of helps white, because after we take knight g2, our knights are slower to the action at this point, so white does benefit almost always in this case from the e takes f2 exchange. So we just leave it be for now. We play knight a6. White is going to try and develop most likely, so knight g2 is my main line and the only move played in a real game according to my database. So what happens if white takes the pawn? That's probably the most burning question at this point. After knight takes c5, take a moment to look at the position, because we are exactly an exchange and a pawn down. But because we are so active, knight d3 is a threat, the rook on c1 and the knight on c3 connection is going to be under attack soon, we're actually okay. The best move white can play here is actually king e2, knight d3, and then knight f3, giving the exchange back. Knight f3, because after rook c2, that's actually a blunder, because after knight f4, bishop takes c2, we have won the rook, and our initiative is still ongoing. So rook c2 is not the right way to give the exchange back. Instead, knight f3 is better, and then after taking, knight d6. This is an interesting position to play. With the bishop pair, strong bishop on g7, and active pieces, we have good enough compensation for the pawn. And I would say the position is roughly equal. Especially the bishop on g7 should prove its worth in this position for sure. So that's why leaving the pawn on e3 and playing knight a6 is actually perfectly okay. But okay, what happens if white just develops? Well, knight f3 is actually a mistake, because after knight e7, the bishop on i8 is trapped. Usually the bishop wants to go to f3, and that's not possible at this point. So knight f3 is a blunder, and if bishop e4, then we take on c3 and then win the bishop on e4. So knight f3 is a mistake. Knight g2, therefore, the only option. And here I have an improvement over the one-plate game. I'm recommending to take on c5. And we could play knight e7 here as well. And but in my opinion, that was an important inaccuracy in a game in 2020. I'll show you why. So bishop f3, the square that we left for the bishop. Knight takes, short castle, e takes f2. And the one problem here is that our knight on e7 is a bad piece at this point. King h1, if white takes on f2, we have a knight d3 move with a double attack. So king h1. And here, black played knight d3 still. Rook c d1, pinning the knight. And now there is a threat with g4 which needs to be dealt with. So g5 was played, and now, compared to the other line, which I will explain in a bit, white now has an important resource, which is g4, bishop g6 to protect the d3 knight, and now the important move bishop e4. And by exchanging the light squared bishop, white actually has solved most of the problems here. And white is winning at this point. So, two problems, the knight on e7 and this bishop b4 idea. So let's combine that. How can we make sure that we aren't allowing white those ideas? Well, we take here first, castle, e takes f2. If white takes on f2, then we can play knight e7 first, bishop f3, knight d3. And after rook d1, you might say, but Roland, do we win material back because the knight's pinned? Well, here we have a nice move, rook c8, which attacks the knight on c3 and the rook on f2. Both are attacked, so now we have successfully equalized at this point. So, king h1 is therefore the better move here. And now after knight d3, rook c d1, the same as the moves we just saw. The extra move here is knight d6. And that's the difference between the line I just showed. The knight's better placed on d6 because it prevents bishop e4. And yeah, it has more options. The knight on d6 now. It's simply better placed. Bishop f3, for example. g5. We're doing exactly the same as in the other game. But now white is struggling to get out. White, whenever I say that, I have to think of Lord of the Rings for some reason. Okay, never mind. So, brain fart. Okay. So, g5. We're threatening g4, winning the bishop on f3. Here, one of the main moves is knight d5 for white. It's still a complicated position, definitely, but if we keep this connection alive, and also, of course, with that, the bishop and the knight on d3, we should have more than enough compensation. So my main line is knight d5, but what happens after g4? Well, now we can successfully play bishop g6. And one of the lines that I've included here is h4, h6, h5, bishop h7, king g2, king comes into play, king f8. We're not in a rush. We're not in a rush. We have everything under control with this construction. Knight d5. Now this does two things. It makes it possible that this knight can move, since the knight on c3 is not attacked anymore. But now after knight b5, we are still creating problems for black. We have a lot of ideas here. For example, if the knight moves, we can put our knight on d4. Well, and yeah, we are still attacking. And objectively, this position, I think, is about equal, actually. The material-wise, it should also be kind of enough because we have the initiative and we have a pawn and a knight for a rook. And that usually is like 1 + 1 is 2. We have enough compensation for the exchange. Let me finish the line because I think it's quite cool. Knight d5, so threatening knight e7. And here I thought that g4 still was a good idea. Oh yeah, notice in the previous line that king f8 was actually to prevent knight. But here I think g4 equalizes on the spot. Because after knight g3, knight e7 leads to the same line more or less. So knight g3, g takes f3, knight e7, king f8, knight takes f5. White has one back piece. Knight takes, f takes g2, king takes g2, knight e1. Oh no, am I losing the rook? White says. No, he's not. Fortunately, I wish it was. But white can take. And now we might be thinking, hey, didn't we lose a piece right now? Because if we take like this with the queen, then he takes here and we lose material. No, because we play f takes e1 knight, and after rook takes, we have equalized successfully. So this was a really cool line that I thought I would share with you. And I think I even gave this as an exercise to one of my students at some point. So yeah, although I'm not 100% sure. Is that it? I think so. Another really long video. Sorry about that. Less than the previous one, so that's good news. But hope it's clear, and I hope you found that this line was pretty cool. Yeah, I was happy to have played this e5 move here at some point. And yeah, I enjoyed that game a lot. So even though it was a blitz game online. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video.